A racist police officer arrests a 98-year-old black woman at a public phone booth, and what happens next changes everything. The officer claimed she was acting suspiciously, but those who witnessed the event knew the truth. Eleanor Green was targeted because of the color of her skin. What seemed like an ordinary arrest would soon unravel into a series of events so shocking they left everyone involved questioning their actions and paying a heavy price for them. Have you ever experienced or witnessed such a moment? A time when prejudice took center stage and someone paid the price for bias? Share your thoughts below, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. More inspiring and thought-provoking stories are coming soon. Don't miss out. The intersection of Elm Street and 15th Avenue was eerily quiet as the late afternoon sun cast sharp, angular shadows on the pavement. Among the stillness stood an old phone booth, its glass panels streaked with years of grime, its presence a stubborn reminder of a bygone era. Most people passed it without a second glance. Today, however, it was anything but ignored. Inside the booth, a hunched figure moved with deliberate urgency. Eleanor Harris, clad in a thick gray coat that dwarfed her frail frame, pressed trembling fingers against the cold metal keypad. Her movements were slow but precise, as if each number she dialed carried immense weight. Her silver hair, illuminated briefly by the sun, seemed to contradict the deep lines of age etched across her face. Yet her eyes, sharp, unwavering, betrayed a determination that defied her 98 years. Across the street, Officer Jack Miller sat in his patrol car, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the booth. He had been parked there for nearly 20 minutes, responding to a vague report of suspicious activity at the intersection. He'd expected troublemakers or maybe a homeless person causing a scene. Instead, he found her. At first, he assumed she was lost or in distress. But as the minutes ticked by, his curiosity sharpened. Eleanor's actions repeated in an odd rhythmic pattern. Insert a coin, dial a number, press the receiver to her ear, whisper a few words, and then slam the receiver down with surprising force. Then, without hesitation, she would start again. Jack frowned, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. Something wasn't adding up. She wasn't asking for help. She wasn't crying. She wasn't panicked. If anything, she seemed calculated, determined. And with each failed call, her frustration grew more palpable. He grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Miller, reporting a possible loiterer at Elm and 15th. Elderly woman, appears agitated, repeatedly using the phone booth." "I'm going to check it out," a static-laced voice replied. "Copy that, Miller. Proceed with caution." Jack opened the car door, stepping onto the asphalt. His boots crunched against the grit of the pavement as he crossed the street, his eyes locked on Eleanor. She didn't seem to notice him at first. Too engrossed in her task, she muttered something under her breath as she fumbled with the coins, her hands visibly trembling. "Ma'am," Jack called out, keeping his tone neutral. "Everything okay here?" Eleanor's head snapped up, her piercing gaze meeting his. For a moment, she didn't answer, her expression unreadable. Then, she slowly lowered the receiver, her thin lips pressing into a firm line. "I need to make this call," she said, her voice low and raspy, as though every word scraped its way out. Jack stopped a few feet from the booth, hands resting on his belt. "You've been here for a while," he said. "Who are you trying to reach?" She turned her back on him without a word and resumed dialing. Jack's patience began to thin. "Ma'am, I need you to answer me. Is there someone you need me to contact for you?" Eleanor paused, her fingers hovering over the keypad. Slowly, she turned to face him again, her eyes narrowing. "No one can help me," she said evenly. "This is something I must do myself." Jack exhaled sharply. "Listen, I understand you're trying to get through to someone, but you've been at this for, what, half an hour? If there's no emergency, I need you to move along." Her lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, one that held no warmth. "You don't understand, officer," she said, "but you will, soon enough." Something about her tone sent a chill down Jack's spine. He hesitated, glancing back toward his patrol car, then at the booth. "I'm not here to argue," he said, keeping his voice firm. "But if you don't leave voluntarily, I'll have to ask you to come with me. Do you understand?" Eleanor tilted her head slightly, studying him as though weighing his resolve. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she set the receiver back on the hook and stepped out of the booth. Her movements were calm, almost graceful, as she extended her thin, wrinkled wrists toward him. "Do what you have to do," she said softly. Jack stared at her, momentarily thrown by her compliance. This wasn't how people usually reacted to being confronted by the police, certainly not to the threat of arrest. Her calmness unnerved him more than any argument or resistance could have. He reached for his handcuffs, snapping them onto her wrists with a muted click. "You're under arrest for loitering," he said, his voice steady but his thoughts racing. Eleanor didn't flinch. She simply stood there, her head held high, her gaze unyielding. "You'll regret this," she murmured, so quietly he almost didn't hear it. Jack's grip on her arm tightened involuntarily. "Let's go," he said, leading her toward his patrol car. As they crossed the street, Jack glanced over his shoulder at the phone booth. It stood silent now, a hollow shell of its former purpose. Yet, for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt as though they were leaving something important behind. Eleanor remained silent as Jack guided her into the back seat. But as he closed the door and walked around to the driver's side, he couldn't shake the weight of her words. "You'll regret this." The phrase echoed in his mind as he started the engine, the low hum of the car failing to drown out the growing sense of unease clawing at him. Jack drove toward the station, his thoughts swirling. He didn't know what he'd gotten himself into. The patrol car hummed quietly as Officer Jack Miller kept glancing at the rearview mirror. Eleanor Harris sat in the back seat, her posture unnaturally straight for someone her age. Her face was blank, unreadable, but her eyes, those sharp, penetrating eyes, seemed to bore into the back of his head. The silence inside the car grew heavier with each passing second, pressing against his chest like a weight. Jack broke the silence. "Why didn't you just tell me what's going on back there?" Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her thin, weathered lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile. "You wouldn't have believed me." Jack tightened his grip on the steering wheel, frustration bubbling beneath his calm exterior. "Try me," he said, glancing at her reflection. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're wasting your time, and mine." Eleanor exhaled slowly, as though the effort to explain was beneath her. "The person I need to reach is not someone you'd understand," she said cryptically, her voice carrying a cold, deliberate tone. "They're the only one who can fix this." Jack's brows furrowed. "Fix what? What's so urgent that you've been standing in that phone booth for nearly an hour calling no one?" His voice sharpened as he added, "Or is this just some elaborate game you're playing?" Her gaze shifted to meet his through the mirror, calm and unflinching. "You don't see it yet, but you will," she said softly. "Soon enough, you'll understand why I had to make that call." Jack's jaw tightened. "I don't have time for riddles, ma'am. If you're in trouble, say so. If not, you've got no business loitering on the street like that." For the first time, her expression shifted. A flicker of something, pity perhaps, crossed her face. "Trouble?" she repeated, almost laughing. "You don't know what trouble looks like, officer." Jack slammed his hand against the steering wheel, his patience wearing thin. "Enough with the cryptic nonsense," he snapped. "Who were you trying to call, and why does it matter?" Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her thin wrists resting against the metal cuffs. "That phone booth isn't just a machine, officer," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It's a thread, a fragile connection to something bigger than you, me, or this entire city. And that thread is unraveling." Jack stared at her in disbelief. "Unraveling? Are you even listening to yourself? You're not making any sense." Her sharp eyes narrowed. "Because you're asking the wrong questions," she replied coolly. "Instead of asking why I was there, you should be asking what happens now that I'm not." Her words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Jack's unease grew, but he refused to let it show. "Right now, what happens is you answering for why you've been acting suspiciously," he said, forcing authority back into his voice. Eleanor leaned back again, her expression unreadable. "You still think you're in control," she murmured. "That's adorable." Jack stopped the car abruptly at a red light, the sudden motion jarring Eleanor, but not eliciting a reaction. He turned in his seat to face her, his tone low but firm. "Ma'am, I don't know who you think you're talking to, but let me make one thing clear. If you don't start cooperating, this is going to get a lot worse for you." Eleanor tilted her head again, studying him like a scientist examining a specimen. "Worse for me?" she repeated. "No, Officer Miller. Worse for you." Her words, spoken without malice or anger, sent an unexplainable chill down his spine. For a moment, he said nothing, caught between the urge to dismiss her as a delusional old woman and the gnawing suspicion that she wasn't bluffing. Jack swallowed hard, forcing himself to focus. "This conversation is over," he said sharply, turning back to face the road. The rest of the ride to the station was silent, but the air between them felt thick with unspoken tension. Every time Jack glanced in the mirror, Eleanor was staring, not at him, but at something beyond him, as though she could see straight through him. As they pulled into the station's parking lot, Jack tried to shake the unease gripping his chest. He parked the car and stepped out, opening the back door to escort Eleanor inside. "Let's go," he said curtly, reaching for her arm. Eleanor stepped out of the car with surprising steadiness, her calm demeanor unnerving him even further. As he led her toward the entrance, she paused for just a moment, her eyes flickering back toward the phone booth in the distance. "Everything changes now," she said softly, almost to herself. Jack tightened his grip on her arm, steering her forward. "Not another word," he muttered, but her voice still echoed in his mind. The patrol car pulled into the station, its headlights cutting through the growing dusk. Jack Miller turned off the engine and glanced at the rearview mirror. Eleanor sat motionless, her hands still in cuffs, her gaze distant yet unsettlingly focused. She hadn't said a word since her cryptic parting remark at the phone booth. The silence weighed heavily on Jack. Her words, "You'll regret this," still ringing in his ears. He stepped out of the car and opened the back door. "Let's move," he said, gesturing for Eleanor to step out. She complied without hesitation, her frail figure steady as she climbed out. As they entered the precinct, the usual hum of activity seemed to pause. Conversations quieted, and officers turned their heads, their expressions a mix of curiosity and confusion. Arresting an elderly woman, especially one as composed as Eleanor, wasn't something they saw every day. "What's this about, Miller?" someone called from across the room, a hint of amusement in his voice. Jack didn't respond, keeping his grip firm on Eleanor's arm as he led her to the processing desk. Eleanor sat down without protest, her back straight, hands cuffed in front of her. Her sharp eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on each person as though cataloging their faces. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't the least bit intimidated. If anything, she seemed in control. "Name?" Jack asked, pulling out a form and a pen. "Eleanor Harris," she replied, her voice steady and unflinching. "Age?" 98. Jack paused, glancing at her. Her voice didn't tremble. Her gaze didn't waver. He felt as if he were talking to someone decades younger, someone who'd been through worse and come out stronger. Behind him, Blake, the department's youngest recruit, leaned against a desk, smirking. "What did she do, Jack? Steal someone's knitting supplies? Or was she speeding in her walker?" The room chuckled softly. Jack turned, his expression hard. "Loitering," he said flatly. "Suspicious behavior at a phone booth. She's been there for nearly an hour, calling no one." Blake snorted. "Loitering? Really? And here I thought we were supposed to be catching real criminals. She looks like she should be teaching Sunday school, not getting hauled in. Maybe she'd have an easier time if she explained what the hell she was doing," Jack snapped, his patience wearing thin. Blake raised his hands in mock surrender. "Relax, man. Just saying, it's a weird look, arresting Grandma over here." Eleanor's lips twitched, just slightly, as though the exchange amused her. "Your young colleague has a point," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension. "I am not the typical person you'd expect to see here, am I?" Blake arched a brow. "See? Even she knows this is ridiculous." Jack slammed his pen down on the desk, turning fully to face Blake. "You want to run this case, Blake? You think you can handle it better? Be my guest. But until then, stay out of it." Blake shrugged, his grin fading as he muttered, "Touchy." Jack turned back to Eleanor, his frustration mounting. She watched him calmly, almost serenely, as though she knew he'd eventually run out of steam. He resumed filling out the form, forcing himself to focus. "Address?" he asked tersely. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "Does it matter?" Jack's grip on the pen tightened. "It's protocol," he said through clenched teeth. "Fairview Retirement Home?" she replied after a pause, her tone almost mocking. Jack scribbled the information down, his mind racing. This wasn't adding up. Her calm demeanor, her cryptic remarks, the phone booth, none of it made sense. She wasn't scared, angry, or confused. If anything, she was waiting. For what? He couldn't figure out. The sound of a ringing phone cut through the room, breaking the tense silence. Officer Reed, seated at a nearby desk, picked up the receiver. "East Precinct," Reed speaking. There was a brief pause as Reed listened. His expression shifted, becoming serious. He glanced toward Jack, his brows furrowing. "Miller, there's a call for you. Guy says his name is Henry Harris." Jack froze. He knew that name. Everyone did. Henry Harris was a renowned historian, often featured on national news for his work, uncovering forgotten pieces of history. But why the hell was he calling about this? He exchanged a quick glance with Eleanor. Her faint smile returned, this time carrying an air of satisfaction. "Take it," she said softly. Jack ignored her and stepped toward Reed's desk, snatching the receiver. "This is Officer Miller," he said, his voice strained. The voice on the other end was cold and authoritative. "Officer Miller, this is Henry Harris. I understand my grandmother, Eleanor Harris, is currently in your custody." Jack blinked, his mind struggling to catch up. "Yes, that's correct," he said cautiously. Henry's tone sharpened. "Then let me be clear. My grandmother is not someone you treat like a common criminal. Whatever misunderstanding led to this, I want her released immediately." Jack frowned. "Sir, she was arrested for suspicious behavior. I'm following standard—" Henry cut him off. "I don't care about your protocols. If she isn't released within the hour, you'll be hearing from my legal team. And trust me, Officer Miller, you don't want that." The line went dead. Jack slowly lowered the receiver, his thoughts racing. Behind him, Eleanor's quiet, knowing gaze met his. "He's very protective, isn't he?" she said, her tone almost playful. Jack didn't answer. For the first time, he wasn't sure what to do next. Jack set the phone down with deliberate care, his mind still processing the sharp, commanding voice on the other end. Henry Harris, one of the most respected historians in the country, had just threatened legal action over the arrest of Eleanor Harris, his grandmother. The room around him buzzed with quiet activity, but Jack felt an eerie stillness settle over him. None of this added up. He turned back to Eleanor, who sat at the processing desk, her wrists still cuffed, her demeanor as calm as ever. "You heard that, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low. Her lips curved into a faint smile, her first real reaction since arriving at the station. "Henry always was quick to act," she said, her tone almost teasing. "He doesn't like seeing things out of place." Jack's frustration flared. He moved closer, lowering his voice to keep the exchange private. "You want to explain why one of the most famous historians in the country just called my station, threatening to bring in lawyers unless I let you go?" Eleanor tilted her head slightly, her sharp eyes gleaming with quiet amusement. "I told you, Officer Miller, you don't understand what's happening yet, but you will." Her cryptic response only irritated Jack further. He leaned on the desk, trying to rein in his temper. "Listen, I've had enough of your riddles. Start talking. Why were you at that phone booth? What's so important that you couldn't leave?" She didn't answer right away, instead meeting his gaze with an unsettling calm. "If I told you everything, you wouldn't believe me," she said finally. "Try me," Jack snapped, his patience wearing thin. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice dropping just enough to force him to listen. "That phone booth is more than a relic, officer. It's a connection to the past, the present, and what comes next. Some connections can't be broken unless someone like you decides to interfere." Jack stared at her, caught between disbelief and curiosity. "What the hell does that even mean? Are you saying this is about history? About Henry?" Eleanor's smile faded, her expression growing serious. "This isn't about Henry," she said softly. "It's about what's coming. And you just delayed the one chance we had to stop it." The weight of her words pressed down on Jack, but he shook it off, unwilling to give in to whatever game she was playing. "You're not making any sense," he said. "If this is so important, why didn't you just call him directly? Why the theatrics?" Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly, her composure unshaken. "Do you think this is theatrical?" she asked. "Do you think I wanted to be here, to be cuffed, paraded through your station like a criminal?" "No, officer. This isn't drama. It's desperation. And now, we've lost precious time." Jack clenched his jaw, the cracks in his confidence beginning to show. He wasn't sure what unnerved him more, her unwavering certainty, or the creeping sense that she might be telling the truth. From behind him, Blake's voice cut through the tension. "What's the deal, Miller? You letting her go or keeping her here until she starts knitting a sweater?" Jack shot him a glare. "Stay out of it, Blake," he growled. Blake smirked but backed off, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Jack turned back to Eleanor. "You're not helping yourself, you know. The more cryptic you get, the less inclined I am to believe you." Eleanor sighed, the smallest crack of impatience breaking through her calm exterior. "It doesn't matter what you believe," she said firmly. "What matters is what you do next." Before Jack could respond, another officer approached, holding out a piece of paper. "Miller, this just came in. It's a fax from Henry Harris's office." Jack grabbed the paper, scanning it quickly. The letterhead was unmistakable, official, polished, authoritative. The message was brief but clear. "Eleanor Harris is not to be detained under any circumstances. Release her immediately or face legal consequences." Jack's hand tightened around the paper as he read the closing line. "She is vital to ongoing research of national importance." He looked up at Eleanor, who was watching him intently. "Vital to research?" he asked, his voice laced with skepticism. "You've been making mysterious phone calls all afternoon, getting arrested, and now I'm supposed to believe you're some kind of national treasure?" Eleanor smiled again, but this time it was almost sad. "I never said you had to believe it," she said quietly. Jack slammed the paper down on the desk, his frustration boiling over. I don't have time for this. Either you start giving me real answers or I'll— You'll what, officer? Eleanor interrupted, her tone sharper than before. Hold me here against your captain's orders? Go ahead, do it. But every second you waste questioning me is another second lost. And trust me, time is the one thing we don't have. Her words hit Jack like a slap. He straightened, unsure how to respond. Before he could say anything, the captain's voice rang out from his office. Miller! My office now! Jack shot Eleanor one last look before turning and walking away, the facts still clutched in his hand. As he stepped into the captain's office, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just another routine case. Eleanor's words and Henry's involvement pointed to something much larger and much more dangerous than he was prepared for. Jack exited the captain's office, his frustration barely contained. The captain's orders were clear. Release Eleanor immediately. But none of this sat right with him. Henry's facts and Eleanor's cryptic demeanor only deepened the mystery. He stormed back to the processing desk, where Eleanor sat as calm as ever. Her cuffed hands rested on the table, her sharp gaze following his every move. Jack pulled out a chair and sat across from her, leaning forward with a determined glare. All right, Eleanor, he said, his tone clipped. I've had enough of the guessing games. Henry Harris is calling the shots from halfway across the country, demanding your release. Why? Why is he so invested in you? Eleanor regarded him for a moment, as though weighing how much to say. Finally, she leaned in slightly, her voice steady, but layered with warning. Henry understands the stakes, Officer Miller. He knows what's at risk if I'm not where I need to be. Jack's patience snapped. What stakes? What risk? Stop talking in circles and tell me what's going on. Eleanor's expression hardened, her calm exterior cracking just enough to reveal the weight of what she was holding back. I can't tell you everything, she said firmly. Not because I don't want to, but because you wouldn't believe me if I did. Jack slammed his fist on the table, startling the nearby officers. Try me, he barked. Eleanor didn't flinch. Instead, she met his anger with cold certainty. Your involvement in this will come at a cost, officer. For you, for the people around you. The deeper you dig, the worse it'll get. Walk away while you still can. Jack leaned back, her words hitting him like a gut punch. Is that a threat? He asked, his voice low. No, Eleanor said simply. It's a warning. One I hope you'll take seriously. Before Jack could respond, Blake's voice cut through the tension. Still grilling Grandma over here. Blake sauntered over, a smirk plastered across his face. You really think you're going to crack her, Miller? She's probably just senile. Jack's glare shifted to Blake. If you're not here to help, stay out of it. Blake raised his hands in mock innocence. Relax. I'm just saying, you're putting a lot of energy into questioning someone who probably doesn't even remember what she had for breakfast. Blake? Jack said through gritted teeth. Get lost. Blake shrugged, clearly enjoying himself. All right. But don't say I didn't warn you when the brass chews you out for wasting time. As Blake walked away, Jack's jaw tightened. Eleanor's faint smile returned as though she found Blake's antics amusing. He's young, she said quietly. Arrogant. But youth always assumes it has all the answers. Jack ignored the comment, focusing instead on the facts still clutched in his hand. He unfolded it and placed it on the table between them. Henry says you're vital to national research. Care to explain what that means? Eleanor glanced at the paper but didn't react. Henry has always had a flair for dramatic wording, she said. But he's not wrong. What I know, what I've lived, is critical. And time is running out to use it. Jack frowned. What you've lived? What's that supposed to mean? Are you saying this is about history? Some kind of classified project? Eleanor leaned back, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly. Do you know how many moments in history were decided by people you've never heard of? People who lived quietly in the background, holding the threads together while the world looked the other way? Jack hesitated. So what? You're one of those people. Eleanor didn't answer directly. The answers you're looking for won't come from me, officer. Not all of them. But if you push this, you'll find yourself in a position you're not ready for. Jack leaned forward again, his frustration boiling over. You keep talking about consequences and risks. What exactly do you think is going to happen? If you want me to believe you, give me something. Anything. Real. Eleanor stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You've already made the first mistake," she said finally. "And now, the rest will follow." Jack opened his mouth to retort, but the phone at the desk behind him rang, cutting him off. Officer Reed picked it up, and after a brief conversation, he turned to Jack. "Miller, Captain wants you back in his office," Reed said. Jack shot Eleanor a final look, his frustration plain on his face. She returned his gaze with a calm, knowing smile. "You're not done yet," she said softly, her tone almost teasing. Jack didn't respond. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, and made his way toward the captain's office. As he walked down the hall, her warning echoed in his mind. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor knew far more than she let on, and that whatever she was protecting might be more dangerous than he was prepared to handle. Jack stood in the captain's office, fists clenched at his sides, while Captain Monroe leaned back in his chair, his expression sharp and unreadable. The fax from Henry Harris lay on the desk between them, its stark message impossible to ignore. "You know what this means, Miller," Monroe said, his voice steady but firm. "You're releasing her." "Now," Jack shook his head, his frustration boiling over. "With all due respect, Captain, this doesn't make sense. She was acting suspiciously, refusing to explain herself, and now a historian, of all people, is threatening legal action if we don't let her go. We're missing something here." Monroe tapped a finger on the desk, his gaze narrowing. "I don't care if it doesn't make sense to you. Henry Harris has enough clout to bury this department if he wants to, and I'm not going to give him a reason to." Jack took a step forward, lowering his voice but not his intensity. "You didn't hear her, Captain. She's hiding something, and whatever it is, it's big. She hinted at events, connections, stuff I can't even begin to explain." Monroe's eyes hardened. "And if she is, that's not your problem, Miller. Your job is to follow orders, not play detective with a 98-year-old woman. Let it go." Jack's jaw tightened. "So what? We just let her walk out of here without answers? Pretend none of this happened?" Monroe leaned forward, his voice dropping into a warning tone. "That's exactly what we're going to do. Release her. That's an order." Jack stared at him for a moment, every instinct in his body screaming to fight back. But Monroe's expression left no room for negotiation. "Understood," Jack said tightly before turning on his heel and leaving the office. Back at the processing desk, Eleanor sat with the same unshakable calm she'd maintained since her arrest. She watched Jack approach, her expression unreadable but faintly amused, as if she already knew the outcome of his conversation. "Looks like you're free to go," Jack said, pulling a key from his belt to unlock her cuffs. Eleanor held out her wrists without a word. As the cuffs came off, she rubbed her wrists lightly, then looked up at him. "Wise decision," she said softly. Jack's temper flared again, but he forced himself to stay composed. "Don't think for a second this is over. You still owe me some answers." Eleanor tilted her head, her gaze sharp and knowing. "I don't owe you anything, Officer Miller, but if you're as persistent as I think you are, you'll find them anyway." Her words lingered in the air as she stood, smoothing her coat. She took a step toward the door but paused, turning back to him. "It's funny," she said, her tone almost wistful. "How much you think you know about the world, only to realize how little you've seen." Jack crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. "Why don't you enlighten me then?" She smiled faintly. "Do you know what it's like to live through a war, to make decisions that ripple through history, knowing no one will ever speak your name? That's the life I've lived, officer. And it's why you don't understand the stakes yet." Before Jack could respond, Eleanor turned and walked out of the station, her steps measured and deliberate. Later that evening, Jack sat at his desk, unable to shake the weight of her words. Against orders, he pulled up her name in the department database. Nothing significant came up. No criminal record, no history of complaints. Nothing to suggest she was anything more than a retired schoolteacher from Fairview. But that didn't satisfy him. There was something deeper, something she wasn't telling him. He began scouring online archives, searching for any mention of Eleanor Harris that could connect her to the world Henry Harris inhabited. Hours passed, and finally he found something. A grainy black-and-white photograph in an old news article. The image showed a younger Eleanor, standing alongside a group of men in military uniforms. The caption read, Allied Intelligence Operatives, 1944. Jack's stomach tightened as he read further. The article described the group's role in covert operations during World War II, though many details were redacted. Eleanor's name was listed, but with no further information about her specific contributions. He clicked on another link, pulling up a declassified file mentioning Eleanor as part of a strategic advisory unit responsible for liaising with high-level officials during the post-war Reconstruction period. Her role was vague, her impact unspoken, but the implications were enormous. Jack leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Who the hell was she? And why was someone with a past like hers standing in a phone booth in the middle of the city, desperately trying to make a call? His thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of his desk phone. He picked it up, half expecting another order from Monroe. "Officer Miller," he said. A deep, unfamiliar voice replied. "You should stop looking into Eleanor Harris, for your own sake." The line went dead before Jack could respond. Jack sat frozen, the phone still in his hand. The warning wasn't just about Eleanor. It was about him now. The deeper he dug, the more tangled the web became, and walking away no longer felt like an option. Jack's night began with a sense of unease and spiraled into something far worse. After Eleanor walked out of the precinct, the station seemed to fall into an odd, unexplainable rhythm. Computers froze without warning. Phones rang, but no one was on the other end when they were answered. Even the lights flickered, casting strange shadows that seemed to shift unnaturally. At first, Jack dismissed it all as coincidence, the kind of random glitches that happen in older buildings. But as the occurrences piled up, the atmosphere turned suffocating. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, whispering about the odd timing of it all. Jack stayed silent, but the knot in his stomach tightened. By the time his shift ended, Jack was ready to leave. The air in the station felt heavy, as if something unseen lingered in every corner. He grabbed his coat, nodded curtly to Blake, who was still smirking about the whole Eleanor incident, and walked out into the night. The moment Jack stepped into his apartment, he knew something was wrong. The door hadn't been forced open, but the feeling of intrusion was unmistakable. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he surveyed the room. His usually neat desk was a mess, papers scattered across the surface. Several items were out of place. His coffee mug sat on the floor instead of the counter. A drawer was partially open, and his laptop screen displayed a blank, flickering white. Jack's chest tightened. He approached the desk cautiously, his hand instinctively brushing his holstered weapon. On the desk, scrawled across one of his notepads in jagged black ink, were the words, "Stop looking." His pulse quickened as he stared at the message, the ink still slightly wet. Whoever had written it wasn't far. Jack spun around, scanning the room, but there was no sign of anyone. The windows were locked, the door undisturbed. He couldn't shake the sensation that he was being watched, even though he was alone. The silence was broken by the sharp ring of his phone. Jack snatched it off the counter, his voice taut as he answered, "Miller." For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then a voice came through, deep, deliberate, and uncomfortably calm. "I warned you, Officer Miller. Let it go." Jack's grip tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" The line went dead. His breath came in short bursts as he slammed the phone onto the counter. He had no idea who was targeting him or why, but one thing was clear. Eleanor Harris wasn't just an old woman with an eccentric past. She was at the center of something much larger and far more dangerous than he'd realized. The next day, Jack's nerves were shot. As he drove through the city, he couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. A black sedan had been tailing him for several blocks, keeping a careful distance but never disappearing from his rearview mirror. He turned abruptly onto a side street, hoping to shake them, but the car followed. He took another sharp turn and parked in an alley, his heart pounding as he watched the sedan cruise slowly past. Jack stayed in the alley for several minutes, his mind racing. Whoever was behind this wasn't just watching him. They were sending a message. That afternoon, Jack returned to the station, determined to dig deeper despite the warnings. As he entered, Blake sauntered over, his trademark smirk firmly in place. "Rough night, Miller?" Blake asked, leaning against a desk. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Jack ignored him, heading straight for his desk. But Blake wasn't done. "Still hung up on Grandma Harris?" Blake pressed. "Or did she leave you a cryptic goodbye letter to obsess over?" Jack stopped and turned, his glare cutting through Blake's grin. I'm not in the mood, Blake. Back off. Blake raised his hands in mock surrender. All right. Just trying to lighten the mood. You're wound tighter than usual. Jack didn't respond. He sat down at his desk and powered on his computer, intent on finding anything he'd missed about Eleanor. But before he could begin, his phone rang again. He hesitated for a moment before answering. Miller. This time, the voice on the other end was familiar and furious. Officer Miller, it's Henry Harris. Jack leaned back in his chair, bracing himself. Mr. Harris, what can I do for you? Henry's tone was cold and clipped. I told you to stop digging. Eleanor has been released. That should have been the end of it. Yet, here we are. Jack frowned. You called my station, threatened legal action, and demanded her release. Now you're upset because I'm trying to understand why. You don't get to have it both ways, Mr. Harris. You don't understand what you're dealing with, Henry snapped. This isn't some routine investigation you can piece together with paperwork. If you keep pushing, you'll only make things worse, for yourself and everyone around you. Jack's temper flared. Worse how? You keep talking in circles, just like Eleanor. If you want me to stop, give me a real reason. Otherwise, I'll keep digging until I find the truth. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Henry spoke again, his voice was lower, almost resigned. You're walking into a storm, officer. Don't say I didn't warn you. The line went dead. Jack set the phone down, his mind churning. He was being watched, his home had been violated, and now Henry Harris was practically begging him to back off. Every step he took toward the truth seemed to push him deeper into a web of danger and secrets. But Jack wasn't the type to back down. He knew one thing for certain. Whatever storm Henry had mentioned, it was already here. Jack leaned forward, determination hardening his features. If Eleanor and Henry wanted him to stop, it only meant one thing. He was getting close to something they didn't want him to find. Jack sat in his car outside the station, the rain tapping against the windshield like a ticking clock. He had spent days spinning his wheels, receiving warnings and vague threats without a single solid answer. It was time to take a different approach. Eleanor Harris wasn't going to hand him the truth on a silver platter, so he needed to go back to where it all started. The phone booth. He parked a block away and walked briskly to the corner of Elm Street and 15th Avenue. The booth stood exactly as it had the night he first found her. Grimy, rusted, and utterly unremarkable. Yet, there was something about it, something Eleanor had all but admitted was significant. Jack opened the booth door and stepped inside. The faint smell of damp metal and old cigarettes hung in the air. He reached for the receiver, letting it dangle while his eyes scanned the interior. The scratches on the glass and peeling paint told one story, but his gut told another. He ran his fingers along the frame, feeling for anything unusual. It wasn't until his hand brushed the base of the phone that he felt it, a slight irregularity in the metal. Crouching down, Jack noticed a faint seam running along the side of the base. Using his pocket knife, he pried it open to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside was a small, tightly folded piece of paper. His heart raced as he unfolded it, revealing a string of numbers and letters written in careful handwriting. AE 1943. D coordinate. Booth signal active. Jack's breath hitched. This wasn't just an ordinary phone booth. It was part of something much larger, something tied to wartime communications. The significance of the 1943 scrawled on the note didn't escape him. This was no accident. Back at the station, Jack dove into the archives, bypassing protocols and digging through records that hadn't been touched in years. Hours passed as he pieced together fragments of information, declassified files, old surveillance records, and even obscure references in local historical articles. Finally, he found what he was looking for. During World War II, certain cities had installed covert phone booths as part of a top-secret communication network. These booths were designed to relay coded messages, allowing operatives to transmit critical information without detection. The file mentioned that most of the booths were decommissioned after the war, their signals terminated, and their equipment dismantled. But one line caught Jack's attention. Some units remained operational for post-war intelligence activities. His blood ran cold. Eleanor hadn't been lying. She had been using the booth to contact someone who, for reasons he couldn't yet fathom, was tied to an active signal from a decades-old network. As he processed the discovery, Jack's desk phone rang. He answered on instinct. "Miller." The voice on the other end was distorted, a mix of static and sharp tones. "Stop now, officer. You've gone far enough." Jack's grip on the receiver tightened. "Who is this? What do you know about the booth?" There was a brief pause, then a chilling reply. "You're not the only one watching. Turn back before it's too late." The line went dead. Jack slammed the phone down, his frustration reaching a breaking point. Whoever was behind this wasn't just protecting a secret. They were actively trying to bury it. Determined to push forward, Jack reviewed the numbers and letters on the note he found. After hours of cross-referencing them against old codes and coordinates, he finally found a match. The sequence pointed to a location on the outskirts of the city, an abandoned building once used as an intelligence hub during the war. Jack didn't wait. He grabbed his jacket and headed out, the weight of the discovery pressing on his shoulders. The building was a relic of a forgotten era, its facade weathered and crumbling. Jack parked a short distance away, approaching cautiously. The rain had turned into a light drizzle, the sound of droplets mixing with the distant hum of traffic. He pushed open the rusted door, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The interior was empty, save for broken furniture and remnants of old equipment scattered across the floor. Yet, as he moved deeper into the space, he noticed something out of place. A small, modern device blinking faintly on one of the desks. It was a signal receiver. Jack stepped closer, examining the device. It was connected to a makeshift power source, its design both simple and highly specialized. This was no amateur setup. Someone had been here recently, and they were still using this place to monitor the signal from the phone booth. As he studied the receiver, a faint noise echoed behind him, a scuff of a shoe against the floor. Jack spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. "Who's there?" he demanded. The shadows remained still, the silence stretching. Jack's pulse raced as he scanned the room, but no one appeared. Whatever or whoever was here didn't want to be seen. Back at the precinct later that night, Jack's thoughts spiraled. He had uncovered a secret that had been buried for decades, yet he was no closer to understanding Eleanor's role in all of this, or the disaster she seemed so desperate to prevent. One thing was clear. The phone booth wasn't just a random location for Eleanor's frantic calls. It was a key to a network still alive, still transmitting, and still dangerous. Jack leaned back in his chair, staring at the blinking cursor on his computer screen. He needed Eleanor again. She was the only one who could explain the truth, and he wasn't going to stop until he found her. Jack parked outside the Fairview retirement home, the rain-soaked streets reflecting the dim glow of streetlights. His chest tightened as he stepped out of the car, his determination outweighing the unease gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. Eleanor Harris was the key to everything, and he wasn't leaving without answers. Inside, the receptionist gave him a wary glance, but didn't ask questions. Jack strode down the quiet hallways, stopping at a door marked Eleanor Harris. He knocked firmly. "Come in," her voice called, steady and composed as always. Jack entered to find Eleanor sitting by the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked up at him with that same knowing gaze, as if she had expected him all along. "I was wondering how long it would take for you to find me," she said, her voice carrying a faint note of amusement. Jack wasted no time. "Enough games, Eleanor. I know about the phone booth. I know it's tied to something bigger than you let on. And I know you've been trying to reach someone connected to that signal." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her calm demeanor unshaken. "You've been busy uncovering things you should have told me from the start," Jack shot back, his frustration bleeding through his tone. "What's the signal for? Who are you trying to contact?" Eleanor rose from her chair, moving to the small table in the center of the room. She poured herself a cup of tea, her movements deliberate, as though weighing her words. "I wasn't trying to contact anyone," she said finally, her back to him. "I was trying to warn them, but now it's too late." Jack took a step closer, his voice sharp. "Warn them about what?" "Enough with the cryptic hints, Eleanor. If you want my help, you need to start talking." She turned to face him, her expression uncharacteristically serious. "You've stumbled into something far bigger than you realize, Officer Miller. That phone booth wasn't just a relic. It was part of a network. A network designed to pass messages during the war, yes, but also one that evolved into something else. Something dangerous. Jack frowned. Dangerous how? Eleanor sighed, gesturing for him to sit. After the war, the world didn't suddenly become peaceful, Jack. The power struggles never stopped. They just became quieter, more insidious. The network was repurposed to monitor global activity, to track movements of those who threatened stability. But like all tools, it fell into the wrong hands. Jack's mind raced, trying to connect the dots. So, the signal? It's still active? And you've been using it to send warnings? She shook her head. No, I've been trying to stop it. The messages being sent now aren't warnings. They're orders. Orders that could destabilize everything. Jack leaned forward, his voice low. Orders from who? Eleanor's gaze hardened. That's the question, isn't it? The people pulling the strings don't leave fingerprints. But trust me when I say their reach is vast and their goals are apocalyptic. Jack stared at her, disbelief warring with the evidence he had uncovered. And you expect me to just take your word for it? Eleanor met his gaze, unflinching. No. I expect you to ask yourself what you've already seen. The warnings, the intrusions, the way your own station is afraid to dig too deep. They're watching you, Jack, just like they're watching me. You've already stepped into their web. Jack's jaw tightened. If what you're saying is true, why don't you go public? Expose them? Her laugh was soft but bitter. You think they'd let me? The moment this story leaves my lips, I disappear, and so would you. The only reason I'm still breathing is because they think I've already lost, that I'm too old, too powerless to stop them. Jack leaned back, her words sinking in. So, what do you expect me to do? Eleanor's expression softened, but her eyes remained sharp. That's the dilemma, isn't it? Do you fight to expose the truth, knowing the cost? Or do you protect it, hoping it's enough to keep the world intact? Jack was silent, the weight of her question pressing down on him. He thought about the warnings, the vandalism, the calls. Every step he'd taken closer to the truth had come with consequences. You've already made your choice, Jack, Eleanor said quietly. You wouldn't be here otherwise. But if you want to act, you'll need to accept what comes with it. Jack stood, his fists clenched at his sides. I didn't sign up for this, Eleanor. But if what you're saying is true, then I don't see another option. Eleanor nodded, her gaze heavy with understanding. Just remember, officer, the deeper you go, the harder it is to come back. And the truth is rarely kind. As Jack walked out of the retirement home, his mind was a whirlwind of questions and doubts. Eleanor had given him pieces of the puzzle, but they were far from enough. He needed to know more about the network, the signal, and the people controlling it. Jack's resolve hardened. The only way forward was to uncover the full truth, no matter the cost. And if Eleanor wasn't going to hand it to him, he'd find it himself. Jack leaned against the hood of his car, the cold night air doing little to calm his racing mind. Eleanor's revelations had shattered any remaining illusion that this was just an unusual case. Now, it was personal. The shadowy warnings, the attempts to deter him, it all pointed to a single conclusion. Someone powerful didn't want him to know the truth. As he prepared to drive off, a faint glint in his side mirror caught his attention. A black SUV idled at the end of the block, its headlights off. Jack felt his stomach drop. He had noticed the same vehicle outside the station earlier, but now there was no mistaking it. He was being followed. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel as he started the engine. Without hesitation, he pulled into the street, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. The SUV followed. Jack turned onto a side street, then another, each time hoping to lose his pursuer. But the SUV stayed on him, its presence a constant shadow. His grip on the wheel tightened as adrenaline surged through his veins. He made a sharp right onto an empty industrial road, slamming the gas pedal to the floor. The SUV sped up in response, closing the gap. Jack swerved left, taking an alley too narrow for the larger vehicle, only to emerge on another street moments later. The SUV appeared again, its engine roaring as it bore down on him. Damn it, Jack muttered under his breath, yanking the wheel hard to avoid an oncoming car. The chase pushed deeper into the city, the maze of streets and alleys doing little to shake the relentless pursuit. Jack's phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Without taking his eyes off the road, he grabbed it, answering breathlessly. "Who the hell is this?" he demanded. Blake's voice came through, sharp and accusatory. "You should have let this go, Miller." Jack's pulse spiked. "Blake? What are you talking about?" "I warned you not to dig too deep," Blake said coldly. "But you just couldn't help yourself, could you? Now you're in over your head." Jack's grip tightened on the phone. "You're behind this? You're working with them? You have no idea what you're dealing with," Blake snapped. "You're chasing ghosts, and all you're going to do is get yourself killed." Jack's car skidded around a corner. His focus split between the conversation and the SUV still closing in. "Why, Blake? Why are you involved in this?" "Because I know how to pick a side," Blake replied. "And you're about to find out what happens when you don't." The line went dead. Moments later, Jack's car lurched as the SUV rammed into his rear bumper. The impact sent him swerving, but he managed to regain control. He veered onto a side street, only to find himself trapped in a narrow dead end. The SUV skidded to a stop behind him, its doors opening in unison. Two figures stepped out, their faces obscured by shadows. Jack didn't wait for introductions. He grabbed his gun from the passenger seat and threw open his door, taking cover behind the car. "Stay where you are!" he shouted, aiming at the advancing figures. They didn't stop. One of them raised a weapon, a long, silenced pistol, and fired. The bullet ricocheted off the hood of Jack's car, sending sparks flying. Jack returned fire, his shots forcing them to scatter. The alley lit up with muzzle flashes as the two sides exchanged gunfire. Jack's breath came in short bursts, his focus narrowed to survival. A voice called from the shadows. "Give it up, Miller. You're outnumbered." It was Blake. Jack's heart sank as his former colleague emerged from the shadows. A smirk plastered across his face. "Told you to let it go," Blake said, his tone mocking. "You're a traitor," Jack shot back, his gun still trained on the others. "What did they promise you? Money? Power?" Blake chuckled darkly. "You think this is about promises? This is survival. You're too stubborn to see that." Jack's frustration boiled over. "You sold out. You're working for the same people who've been trying to bury the truth." Blake's smirk faded, his expression hardening. "The truth doesn't matter, Miller. The world keeps spinning no matter who's pulling the strings. But you couldn't just play along." Blake raised his weapon, but Jack fired first. The bullet grazed Blake's shoulder, forcing him to retreat behind a dumpster. "You always were a lousy shot," Blake taunted, though his voice carried a hint of pain. Jack didn't respond. He used the distraction to reload, his eyes scanning for an escape route. The alley was too confined, but a stack of crates near a fire escape caught his attention. The gunfire resumed, pinning Jack behind his car. He knew he couldn't hold them off much longer. Taking a deep breath, he sprinted toward the crates, firing blindly to keep his attackers at bay. Blake shouted something, but Jack didn't catch it. He scaled the fire escape, the metal creaking under his weight. Reaching the rooftop, he didn't stop. He jumped to the next building, his lungs burning as he pushed himself forward. Below, the figures regrouped, shouting into radios. Jack didn't wait to hear their plans. He kept moving, leaping from one rooftop to the next until he was out of sight. He finally stopped in an abandoned lot several blocks away, his chest heaving as he leaned against a wall. The city lights glowed faintly in the distance, but the shadows seemed to stretch endlessly around him. Jack knew he had narrowly escaped, but the danger wasn't over. Blake's betrayal had confirmed his worst fears. The people behind this weren't just powerful. They were everywhere. Jack wiped the sweat from his brow, his resolve hardening. If they thought this would stop him, they were wrong. He would find the truth, no matter how far he had to go. Jack sat across from Eleanor in the dimly lit room of a safe house she had insisted upon. The sterile air hummed with tension, as Jack's frustration finally broke the silence. "Enough, Eleanor," he snapped. "No more riddles, no more cryptic warnings. I've been chased, shot at, and betrayed. I deserve the truth. Now." Eleanor leaned forward, her sharp eyes locking onto his. "You think you're ready for the truth, Jack? That knowing it will somehow make this easier for you?" Her tone was cold but edged with a faint trace of pity. "I'll take my chances," Jack replied, his jaw tightening. Eleanor sighed, sitting back in her chair. For the first time, she looked her age, tired, worn, and weighed down by years of secrets. "What do you know about Henry's work?" Jack frowned. "He's a historian. famous for uncovering classified files and exposing cover-ups. What does that have to do with you? It has everything to do with me, Eleanor said quietly. And everything to do with what he found. The truth buried under decades of lies. Jack's hands balled into fists on the table. What truth? Eleanor's gaze bore into him. After the war, there were agreements made in the shadows. Decisions that shaped the world we live in today. Alliances that were never meant to see the light of day. Henry uncovered one of those secrets. A pact that secured power for a select few at the cost of millions. Jack's brow furrowed. What kind of pact? Eleanor hesitated, then continued. It wasn't just about money or influence, Jack. It was about control. Technology, resources, and even people. Leverage to maintain dominance over entire nations. Henry found evidence of this network, but it was incomplete. He came to me for the missing pieces. Jack stared at her, disbelief flickering across his face. You're saying you were part of this? That you helped build it? Eleanor's voice hardened. I helped destroy it, or so I thought. During the war, I worked in intelligence, covert operations most people have never even heard of. We intercepted messages, dismantled operations, and neutralized threats before they could escalate. That phone booth? It was part of a network we used to relay critical information. But after the war, it was repurposed, corrupted. Jack shook his head. Why didn't you stop it then? Because I didn't know, Eleanor admitted, her voice heavy with regret. Not until years later, when I realized the people I trusted had used the same system to consolidate their power. By the time I understood, it was too late. The network was already woven into the fabric of governments, corporations, and militaries. Exposing it meant destabilizing the entire world. Jack leaned back, the weight of her words sinking in. And Henry, what did he find that put him, and you, in danger? Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. Proof that the network still exists, that it's still being used to manipulate global events. He found documents, recordings, names, but he needed my knowledge to make sense of it. Jack's breath hitched. And what happens if this gets out? Eleanor's expression darkened. Chaos. Wars would break out. Economies would collapse. Trust in institutions would erode completely. Millions would suffer, and those at the top would do whatever it takes to maintain their grip on power. Henry and I both knew the cost of exposing the truth. Jack stared at her, his mind racing. So you're saying we just let this go? Let them keep controlling everything? Eleanor's voice softened. I'm saying there's no clean solution, Jack. Exposing the truth comes with consequences, but so does burying it. Jack's frustration boiled over. You can't seriously expect me to walk away from this. People deserve to know what's happening, what's been done to them. And who do you think will benefit from that knowledge? Eleanor countered. The people you're trying to protect? Or the very ones who will exploit the chaos for their own gain? Jack stood, pacing the room. So what? We let them win. Let them keep pulling the strings while the rest of us suffer in ignorance? Eleanor didn't flinch. It's not about winning or losing, Jack. It's about survival. Sometimes the only way to fight is to work quietly, in the shadows, to weaken their grip without tearing everything apart in the process. Jack turned to face her, his voice low and steady. That's not good enough. Eleanor met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Then you have a choice to make. Expose what you know and face the fallout, or bury it and live with the weight of that decision. Jack left the safe house, his thoughts a storm of conflict. He had seen enough to know Eleanor wasn't lying, but the implications of her story were staggering. If he exposed the truth, it could upend everything. But at what cost? His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from an unknown number. Choose wisely. The world is watching. Jack stared at the screen, his heart pounding. Jack knew his next move would define the rest of his life. With every step, the weight of the choice pressed heavier on him. But no matter what he decided, there would be no turning back. The story broke like a thunderclap. Every major news outlet was running it. A shadowy post-war network manipulating global events for decades. Documents leaked anonymously detailed the network's influence, implicating politicians, corporations, and military leaders. The world reeled in shock. Protests erupted. Governments scrambled to deny, deflect, and contain the fallout. Jack Miller sat in his small apartment, watching the chaos unfold on his television. His face was drawn, his eyes bloodshot. The choice he'd made, to send the evidence to a trusted journalist, had changed everything. But as he stared at the screen, he didn't feel victorious. His phone buzzed on the counter, drawing his attention. It was another message from an unknown number. "You've set it in motion. Are you ready for what comes next?" Jack's hands trembled as he read the words. Whoever was behind the network wasn't gone. They were regrouping, recalculating. He had exposed their secrets, but they still held power, and now he was firmly in their crosshairs. The knock on his door later that night wasn't unexpected. Jack grabbed his sidearm, keeping it hidden as he opened the door. It was Henry Harris. The historian looked older than he had in his media appearances, haggard, weary, and worn down by the fallout of the leak. Without waiting for an invitation, Henry stepped inside. "You've made quite a mess," Henry said, his tone sharp. Jack shut the door behind him, his patience thin. "A mess? This was your game from the start. You wanted the truth out there. Don't act like you didn't know the risks." Henry turned, his eyes flashing. "I knew the risks, Officer Miller. What I didn't anticipate was the recklessness. You didn't just pull the curtain back, you tore it off. Now there's nothing stopping the chaos." Jack took a step closer, his frustration spilling over. "You came to me because you couldn't do it yourself. Don't stand here and lecture me about consequences." Henry's expression softened, but his voice remained firm. "Do you think this is over? That exposing the truth was enough? The people you're fighting, they thrive in chaos. They'll use this as an opportunity to tighten their grip, not loosen it." Jack folded his arms, his gaze unwavering. "So what do you suggest? That I just let them keep running things in secret? Let them bury everything again?" Henry sighed heavily, the weight of decades of knowledge visible in his posture. "No. But you need to understand. This isn't a battle you win in one move. It's a war of attrition. You expose them, yes, but now they'll come for you, and for anyone who stands with you." After Henry left, Jack sat in silence, his thoughts a maelstrom. The sound of his phone ringing broke the stillness. He picked it up, half expecting another veiled threat. Instead, it was a call from the precinct. "Blake's gone," the voice on the line said, grim and hollow. "What do you mean, gone?" Jack asked, his pulse quickening. "Disappeared. No trace. And Miller, you need to be careful. Whoever's cleaning this up, they're not leaving loose ends." The call ended abruptly, leaving Jack staring at the phone in his hand. The next morning, Jack returned to the retirement home, hoping to find Eleanor. He needed answers, needed to know what her plan had been all along. But when he arrived, the staff told him she had left. No forwarding address, no explanation. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Her room was empty, save for a single envelope on the bedside table addressed to Jack. He opened it carefully, unfolding a handwritten note. "The truth is out. The fight is yours now. Be ready for what comes next. E.H." In the weeks that followed, the world grew more unstable. Governments fell. Corporations dissolved under scrutiny. But the faces behind the network, the ones truly responsible, remained elusive. Jack stayed off the grid as much as possible, moving frequently and using burner phones to stay ahead of those who might come for him. Late one night, as he sat in a dimly lit motel room, his laptop beeped with a notification. An email had come through from another anonymous sender. It contained a single attachment, a photograph of Eleanor Harris in her youth, standing with a group of men in military uniforms. Beneath it were the words, "This is just the beginning." The room was silent, but his thoughts were deafening. Somewhere out there, the people he had exposed were already regrouping, their influence far from broken. And Eleanor? She had vanished, leaving him with only questions and the burden of a truth too big to contain. For a moment, Jack wondered if he had done the right thing. The world was unraveling, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd only scratched the surface. He closed the laptop and leaned back, staring at the cracked ceiling. His fight was far from over. But what about you? If you had the power to expose a secret that could change everything, no matter the cost, would you take the risk? If you were drawn into Jack's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay tuned for more gripping tales. Every action you take helps bring these stories to life. The truth is out there. Will you be the one to uncover it?
The low hum of conversation filled Harvest Grove, accompanied by the clink of polished silverware against porcelain. The restaurant was alive, warm yellow lights spilling onto pristine tablecloths, soft jazz floating through the air, and a scent of rosemary and roasted vegetables teasing its senses. It was everything Marcus Harris had worked for, elegant, respected, and alive with a pulse that could only come from years of hard-earned dreams realized. Marcus sat alone near the back corner, tucked in a booth that offered a clear view of the floor. His clothes were plain, faded jeans, a dark sweater, scuffed sneakers, just another young man among the crowd. He liked it that way. Blending in. Observing. He watched the servers glide between tables, balancing trays of tenderloin and artisanal pastas, the customers laughing quietly or snapping quick photos of their plates. "Looks good tonight," he murmured to himself, his voice low. No one paid him any attention, just the way he wanted. Except for one man. The bell above the door jingled sharply, interrupting the harmony. Officer Stephen Reynolds stepped inside, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. He was broad-shouldered, his police uniform crisp and immaculate, the badge on his chest catching the dim light. His gaze swept over the restaurant like a hawk surveying prey, cold and judgmental. Some customers glanced at him, uneasy, then quickly looked away. Reynolds' presence seemed to suck the air from the room. Marcus noticed him immediately. Years of experience taught him to recognize that posture, arrogant, searching, ready. His heart gave a dull thud, but his expression remained calm, unreadable. Reynolds scanned the room until his eyes fell on Marcus. Something in his gaze sharpened, narrowing like a target locked in. Without hesitation, the officer crossed the room. Marcus felt him coming before he heard him. "Hey," Reynolds said, his voice curt. "You." Marcus looked up, meeting Reynolds' piercing gaze. "Me." Reynolds' eyes flicked over him, taking in the plain clothes, the worn shoes, and Marcus' stillness. "Yeah, you. What are you doing here?" "I'm having dinner," Marcus said evenly, keeping his tone polite. Reynolds' lips twitched. "Dinner? Here?" He laughed once, a short, bitter sound. "You sure about that?" Marcus raised an eyebrow but stayed quiet. Around them, the room seemed to falter. A server froze mid-step, her tray wobbling slightly as she glanced between the two men. At a table nearby, a couple stopped eating, their forks hovering in the air. Reynolds leaned down, planting his hands on the edge of the table. "This isn't the kind of place where you just hang around, you know? What are you really doing here?" Marcus felt the eyes, everyone's eyes. He could almost hear the unspoken thoughts swirling around him. What's going on? Did he do something? "I'm not causing trouble," Marcus replied carefully. His voice remained calm, almost disarming. Reynolds straightened up and folded his arms across his chest. "Show me some ID." A few gasps rose quietly from surrounding tables. A nearby server, a young man no older than 20, stepped forward nervously. Sir." "Stay out of this," Reynolds snapped without looking at him. Marcus slowly reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. He slid his driver's license across the table. Reynolds snatched it up and studied it, his frown deepening. "Marcus Harris," Reynolds read aloud, like it left a bad taste in his mouth. "What are you doing sitting here alone, Marcus?" Marcus' jaw tightened, but his tone remained polite. "Is that a crime, officer?" "Don't get smart with me," Reynolds barked, slamming the license back on the table. A few customers flinched. "I know your type. You think you can just sit around and blend in, huh?" Marcus exhaled slowly, the edges of his control sharpening like glass. "My type? And what type is that?" Reynolds smirked, a cruel glint in his eyes. "Come on. Don't play dumb." Around them, the tension thickened, hanging like smoke. Servers whispered to one another, glancing toward the back office, where Peter Carlson, the restaurant manager, was working. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Reynolds said abruptly. "You don't belong here." The words sliced through Marcus like a blade, but outwardly, he didn't flinch. He simply tilted his head and looked Reynolds directly in the eye. "Why's that, officer?" "Don't test me, kid," Reynolds snapped. His voice rose just enough to carry through the room, drawing more attention. "People like you don't sit in places like this. You're either casing the joint, looking for trouble, or waiting for someone else to pay the bill. So don't waste my time. Marcus felt something shift inside him, rage, bitter and raw, clawing at the edges of his calm. But he'd been here before. Years ago. A teenager on a sidewalk. An officer like Reynolds accusing him of something he hadn't done. Handcuffs digging into his wrists. His mother crying as they drove him away. "Sir," one of the servers interjected desperately. I think you're making a mistake." "He's not. I said stay out of it." Reynolds roared, spinning toward her. The girl shrank back, her face pale. Marcus slowly stood up. He wasn't a big man, but his presence grew in that moment, steady, undeniable. Around them, the restaurant went utterly silent. "Do you feel better?" Marcus asked softly. Reynolds turned back to him, startled. "What? Does it make you feel powerful?" Marcus continued. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned. "Humiliating people? Assuming the worst about someone just because you think you know them?" Reynolds' face turned red, his authority starting to crack. "Watch your mouth." "No," Marcus' voice dropped, deadly quiet, like a storm gathering strength. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through to sit at this table. You don't know how hard I worked to earn this place. But you decided, the moment you walked in, that I didn't belong. Didn't you?" Reynolds opened his mouth, but no words came out. "Officer Reynolds," a voice boomed from behind. Peter Carlson strode across the floor, his face flushed with anger. "What the hell is going on here?" Reynolds turned, a flash of relief crossing his face. "Peter, this guy. Peter cut him off, gesturing toward Marcus. "That's Marcus Harris." Reynolds blinked. "And?" Peter's voice rose, each word deliberate. "He owns this restaurant." The room held its breath. Reynolds froze, the color draining from his face. His mouth opened, then closed. Slowly, his eyes turned to Marcus, filled with shock and a deep, sinking shame. Marcus stood there, silent and still, his gaze steady. "You've got to be kidding me," Reynolds muttered, his voice hoarse. "I'm not." Peter's tone was ice. "You humiliated the owner of this restaurant in front of his customers. I'd suggest you leave. Now." For the first time, Reynolds looked small. His shoulders slumped as he glanced around the room, meeting the cold, condemning stares of diners who'd witnessed every second. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. As it closed behind him, the restaurant remained in stunned silence. Marcus exhaled softly and sat back down, his hands resting on the table. He ignored the whispers and the eyes still watching him. "I'm sorry, Marcus," Peter said quietly. Marcus shook his head. "It's not your fault." But deep down, he knew this wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. The air in Harvest Grove remained heavy, as though the walls themselves were trying to absorb the echoes of what had just happened. Some customers had returned to their meals, though their forks moved more slowly, conversations hushed. Others pretended to glance at their phones, avoiding Marcus' gaze entirely. It didn't matter, he'd learned a long time ago what silence meant. Peter Carlson, the restaurant manager, sat across from Marcus now, his face tight with embarrassment and anger. Peter was in his early 30s, tall and lean, with sandy blonde hair and a nervous energy that usually came off as harmless. "Not tonight." "That guy's a damn idiot," Peter said, his voice low but shaking. "I should have thrown him out the second I saw him open his mouth." Marcus leaned back in the booth, his hands resting calmly in his lap, though his mind wasn't as composed as his demeanor. "It's done now, Pete." Peter's face flushed. "It's not done. He humiliated you in your own restaurant. Your place. I can't let that slide." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "And what are you going to do? Call the NYPD and ask them to discipline one of their own?" His words were steady, but the sharp edge of sarcasm cut through. "We both know how that'll go." Peter exhaled sharply, glancing around the room as though looking for someone to blame. "People saw that, Marcus. What if it spreads? A cop harassing the owner of Harvest Grove? This restaurant's too new to survive bad press." Marcus looked up, locking eyes with his friend. "I don't care about the press." "Well, I do," Peter snapped. He immediately winced, realizing how harsh he sounded. "Sorry." I didn't mean that. It's not fair. None of it. Marcus tilted his head, his expression softening. You think I don't know that? Peter looked down at his hands, shame settling into the lines of his face. Marcus didn't let the silence stretch. He sat forward, voice gentle but firm. I've been dealing with people like him my whole life. The uniform doesn't matter. The look is always the same. You shouldn't have to, man, Peter muttered. You own this place. You've worked harder than anyone to get here. Marcus smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. And what difference does that make? To him, I was just another guy who didn't belong. Peter didn't know how to respond, so he didn't. Instead, he looked over his shoulder toward the entrance. The door remained closed, the bell silent, as though even the restaurant was bracing for what came next. Marcus followed his gaze. Go check on the staff. Make sure everyone's okay. You sure? Yeah. Peter hesitated before nodding, standing, and disappearing into the back. Marcus stayed where he was, his hands tracing the edge of the table absently. A small tremor ran through his fingers. Frustration or adrenaline, he wasn't sure. He hated how familiar this feeling was. How normal it still felt to be judged for something as simple as sitting quietly in his own space. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. Excuse me. Marcus looked up to see a woman standing at the edge of his booth. She was middle-aged, with dark hair pinned in a neat bun and glasses perched low on her nose. Her hands trembled slightly, clutching the strap of her purse. I'm sorry to bother you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I saw what happened, and I wanted to say, she faltered, then gathered herself. You handled that with so much grace. Marcus blinked, caught off guard. Thank you. I mean it, she pressed, taking a hesitant step closer. I didn't say anything when it was happening, and I regret that. I should have spoken up. You don't need to apologize, Marcus replied gently. The woman shook her head. No, I do. People like that. They get away with it because people like me stay quiet. Her voice wavered. So thank you for standing your ground. Marcus offered her a small nod, though his chest felt heavier. Thank you for saying that. She smiled weakly, then turned and walked back to her table, her heels clicking softly against the floor. Marcus watched her leave, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and exhaustion. It wasn't long before another figure appeared at the booth. A young waiter, no older than 19, stood there fidgeting. His name tag read Jake. Hey, Mr. Harris. Marcus glanced up. Yeah. The kid swallowed, clearly nervous. I just wanted to, I wanted to say I'm really sorry. I didn't know what to do. I should have stepped in, but... You were afraid, Marcus finished for him. Jake's face turned red. Yeah. Marcus studied him for a moment before sighing softly. You don't need to feel bad, Jake. It wasn't your fight. Jake shook his head. It shouldn't have happened. Not to you. You're the one who gave me this job, Mr. Harris. I didn't know what to say, but I wanted to say something. I didn't. Marcus looked at the boy's face, earnest, full of regret, and realized how much had changed. 10 years ago, when Marcus was Jake's age, no one would have dared apologize. People either looked away or watched like it was entertainment. Maybe it wasn't enough, but this small moment felt like progress. You're good, Jake, Marcus said finally. You did what you could. Jake nodded stiffly before hurrying off, his sneakers squeaking against the polished floors. Marcus let out a long breath, rubbing a hand across his face. He wasn't angry at Jake or Peter or even the woman who'd spoken up. They'd all meant well. But their responses, their guilt, felt like reminders of the world he lived in. A world where his success didn't shield him from being seen as less than. The door to the restaurant jingled again. Marcus looked up instinctively, his body tensing, but this time it was no one in uniform. Just a couple in their 30s, arm in arm, laughing softly as they were greeted by the host. Marcus exhaled slowly, steadying himself. Mr. Harris. Peter was back, standing by the booth with a look of determination. I called the district. Left a message about what happened. Marcus' eyes narrowed. You shouldn't have done that. Yes, I should have, Peter insisted. It's not about revenge. It's about accountability. Marcus shook his head, but there was no point arguing. The wheels had already been set in motion. You're not alone in this, Peter added quietly. Marcus met his gaze, feeling the truth of those words. He wasn't. Not anymore. Still, as he leaned back and glanced around Harvest Grove, Marcus couldn't shake the weight pressing against his chest. Today had been another test. Another reminder. He'd handled it. He always did. But how many times would he have to? The lights of Harvest Grove felt brighter now, the hum of conversation steadily returning as the evening wore on. Marcus remained at his table, no longer an invisible observer but the center of an incident that lingered in the air like a heavy fog. He could feel it, the stolen glances, the murmurs that faded whenever he looked up. For the past hour, Marcus had tried to push it all aside. He'd spoken to the staff, reassured Peter that he was fine, and even offered polite smiles to the customers who approached him with weak apologies or awkward words of support. But despite his calm exterior, a storm brewed beneath the surface, one he hadn't felt in years. Peter had left him alone for a moment, stepping back into the office to field a call from someone at the police department. Marcus, meanwhile, stared absently at the glass of water in front of him, his mind drifting back. 12 years earlier. The fluorescent lights in the station buzzed faintly, mingling with the sharp tap of shoes against the linoleum floors. 17-year-old Marcus sat in the hard plastic chair, staring at the scuff marks on his sneakers. His wrists ached from the too tight handcuffs they'd only just removed. He hadn't said a word in 2 hours, not since the officers had picked him up 2 blocks from his own home, accusing him of fitting a description. He'd been walking back from the bodega, a soda in one hand and a bag of chips in the other. They'd thrown him against the hood of the car before he could even ask what was happening. "Do you think this is funny?" Marcus looked up to see a tired, middle-aged officer glaring at him from across the table. "I didn't do anything," Marcus said quietly. The officer slammed his fist on the table. "Don't lie to me, kid. You were where you shouldn't have been. You know it, I know it." Marcus' stomach churned. "I was walking home. Save it." The officer leaned in, his face inches from Marcus. "Guys like you always have a story. You think you're smarter than us? That you'll talk your way out of this?" Marcus gritted his teeth, willing himself not to respond. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "Stay quiet, Marcus. Don't give them a reason." The door to the room creaked open then, and a familiar voice called out, sharp and commanding. "What the hell is going on here?" Marcus turned to see his mother, her face drawn tight with worry, but her posture strong. Behind her was the man who ran the community center, Mr. Langston, a mentor who always seemed to show up when Marcus needed him most. "This boy isn't who you think he is," Mr. Langston said firmly. "Let him go." The officer hesitated, his anger flickering into something else, reluctance, maybe guilt. Marcus didn't understand it then, but as he sat there now, 12 years later, the memory hit harder than it ever had. The scrape of a chair pulled Marcus back into the present. He blinked, glancing up to see Peter sinking into the seat across from him again, his phone still in hand. "They're investigating," Peter announced, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it would amount to much. "They said Reynolds has a record, complaints about excessive force and racial profiling. Nothing ever sticks, though." Marcus nodded, unsurprised. "It won't this time either." Peter frowned. "You don't know that." Marcus' lips twitched into a faint, humorless smile. "I do." Peter shifted in his seat, frustrated. "You can't just let it go, Marcus. If we don't push back, nothing changes." Marcus stared at him for a long moment before responding. "You think I don't know that? I've been pushing back my whole life, Pete." He paused, his voice quieter. "But it doesn't matter how much you fight. Some people still see what they want to see." Peter didn't know how to argue with that. Before either of them could say more, the restaurant door swung open again, and Marcus froze. Officer Reynolds stood there, flanked by another man in a suit, a department official, maybe, and the tension in the room spiked like a live wire. Marcus could feel every set of eyes turn toward them as the two men walked straight for him. Peter stiffened. "What the hell is he doing back here?" "Stay calm," Marcus muttered, though his pulse had quickened. Reynolds reached the table, his face set like stone. He looked smaller somehow, less intimidating than he had earlier. The man in the suit, a middle-aged black man with sharp features and a weary expression, spoke first. "Mr. Harris, I'm Deputy Inspector Paulson. I want to formally apologize for the incident earlier today." Marcus inclined his head slightly, his face unreadable. Paulson gestured toward Reynolds, who looked as though he wanted to be anywhere else. Officer Reynolds would also like to say a few words. Reynolds didn't move at first. Finally, after an awkward pause, he cleared his throat. I misjudged the situation," he said stiffly, avoiding Marcus' gaze. "I shouldn't have acted the way I did." The words hung in the air, hollow and insincere. Marcus studied him, waiting to see if there would be more. There wasn't. "That's it," Peter said incredulously. "That's his apology." "Peter," Marcus said softly, holding up a hand. He turned his attention back to Reynolds, his voice calm and steady. "You don't know me, officer. You didn't care to. You saw what you wanted to see, and you acted on it. That's not an accident. It's a choice." Reynolds' jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "Mr. Harris, we'll be following up internally," Paulson said, clearly eager to move on. "Again, our apologies." The two men turned and left, Reynolds' shoulders hunched as he followed. The door jingled shut behind them, and the restaurant exhaled. Peter stared after them, his hands curled into fists. "That's it. He gets to walk out." Marcus leaned back in his seat, finally letting out the breath he'd been holding. "It's always been like this." "It doesn't have to be," Peter argued. "People saw what happened, Marcus. We could take this further. The press would eat it up." Marcus shook his head slowly. "I don't need headlines. I need this place, my place, to keep standing. That's how I win." Peter opened his mouth to argue again, but Marcus cut him off. "Trust me, Pete." Peter slumped back in defeat. "Fine. But this isn't over. It can't be." Marcus didn't respond. He glanced around the room, the faces of his customers still watching him, some with admiration, some with guilt, others with quiet curiosity. He'd fought this battle 1,000 times before, and he knew he'd fight it 1,000 more. But tonight, he wasn't broken. Tonight, he still stood. And for now, that was enough. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Harvest Grove, casting long beams across the empty dining room. The restaurant sat still, peaceful, as if the events of the previous night were nothing but a distant memory. But for Marcus Harris, sitting alone at one of the tables with a steaming mug of black coffee, the weight of the confrontation lingered like smoke in the air. Peter's voice broke the quiet as he strode in from the back office, clutching a tablet in his hand. "Marcus, have you seen this?" Marcus didn't need to ask what this was. He already knew. He'd felt it coming the moment Reynolds walked back through those doors the night before. "Harvest Grove is all over social media," Peter continued, his voice tinged with disbelief. "People recorded everything. The confrontation, the apology, well, if you can call it that, and now everyone's talking about you. About what happened." Marcus glanced up, his expression unreadable. "What are they saying?" Peter pulled out a chair, dropping into it with an energy that bordered on anxious. "Some people are furious at Reynolds. Others are calling you a hero, a symbol of dignity under fire, or whatever. Then there are the idiots trying to twist it, saying you probably did look suspicious." Marcus' lips curled into a humorless smile. "Of course they are." Peter leaned forward, setting the tablet on the table and showing Marcus a video with thousands of views. The shaky footage showed Reynolds looming over Marcus, his voice raised and full of authority. Then came Peter's sharp words. "He owns this restaurant." And the silence that followed. In the video, Marcus' calm response stood out, his voice steady and deliberate. "You saw what you wanted to see. That says more about you than it does about me." The comments beneath the video were a battlefield of opinions. Supportive voices praised Marcus for his composure. Others, faceless and cruel, picked at every detail: his clothes, his demeanor, his mere existence in a place like Harvest Grove. "I'm sorry, man," Peter said after a beat. "I know you don't want this kind of attention." Marcus stared at the video for a moment longer before pushing the tablet away. "I didn't ask for it, but here it is." And what are you going to do about it? Marcus took a sip of his coffee, letting the bitter warmth settle him. What I always do. Keep moving forward. Peter shook his head, clearly frustrated. I don't get you, Marcus. Most people would be shouting about this from the rooftops. Press conferences, lawsuits, the whole thing. I'm not most people, Marcus replied simply. Peter opened his mouth to argue, but Marcus cut him off. Do you know what happens to people like me when we react the way the world expects us to? We lose. Every time. I kept my composure because that's what I had to do. Not for them, but for me. Peter's frustration ebbed, replaced by a quiet understanding. He'd known Marcus long enough to know when to let it go. You think Reynolds is going to get away with this, don't you? Peter asked after a pause. Marcus shrugged. He might. He's gotten away with it before. But not this time. Marcus tilted his head. You sound confident. Peter smirked faintly. Because I know you, Marcus. You might not shout, but you don't let things go. Marcus didn't answer, but Peter wasn't wrong. As calm as Marcus appeared on the surface, there was a fire burning underneath. He'd spent his life mastering the art of holding that fire in check, but he'd also learned how to use it when the time was right. By the afternoon, the story had spread beyond social media. Local news stations picked it up, their headlines dramatic and polarizing. Restaurant owner harassed by officer in shocking confrontation. Police department faces scrutiny after racial profiling incident. Marcus stood in the back office, the glow of the television reflecting off the walls as a news anchor summarized the events. The footage played again. Marcus sitting calmly as Reynolds berated him, Peter stepping in with anger, the room falling silent as the truth came out. Turn it off, Marcus said quietly. Peter grabbed the remote and clicked the screen to black. I hate seeing that guy's face. Marcus didn't respond. Instead, he turned to the window, looking out at the street below. A small group of reporters had gathered outside Harvest Grove, their cameras and microphones at the ready. You're going to have to say something eventually, Peter pointed out. I know. Peter hesitated. Do you want me to handle it? I can tell them you're not making a statement. Marcus shook his head. No. I'll do it. Peter stared at him. Are you sure? You don't owe anyone anything, Marcus. I know, Marcus repeated. But this isn't just about me anymore. An hour later, Marcus stepped out onto the sidewalk, his hands in his pockets and his expression calm. The reporters surged forward, their voices overlapping as they shouted questions. Mr. Harris, how do you feel about Officer Reynolds' behavior? Do you plan to press charges? What message do you have for the community? Marcus raised a hand, and the crowd quieted, microphones angling toward him. He waited a beat, letting the silence settle. I didn't ask for any of this attention, Marcus began, his voice carrying over the street. And I don't need anyone to make me a hero. What happened in my restaurant was wrong, but it's not new. It's not surprising. It's something people like me have faced for a long time. The reporters murmured, scribbling furiously. I'm not here to call for vengeance, Marcus continued. I'm here to call for accountability, for understanding, for respect. Not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been judged before they had a chance to speak. The camera's word, capturing every word. I built Harvest Grove because I believe in second chances. I believe people can be better. And maybe, just maybe, this moment can be a chance for all of us to start seeing each other differently. He paused, letting the weight of his words linger before turning and walking back into the restaurant. Inside, Peter was waiting, his face a mix of pride and disbelief. You really don't do things the easy way, do you? Marcus allowed a small smile. When has anything in my life been easy? Peter chuckled. Fair point. As Marcus walked through the restaurant, he noticed the way his staff looked at him now, proud, inspired. Jake, the young waiter from the night before, stood a little taller. Even the servers who'd been too scared to intervene seemed to carry themselves differently. Maybe this wasn't over. Maybe Reynolds would still get off easy. But Marcus had spoken his truth, and he wasn't afraid anymore. For now, that was enough. The days following the incident at Harvest Grove passed in a blur. The video continued to circulate online, gaining national attention. News segments debated the issue of racial profiling, while activists held discussions about justice and accountability. Some praised Marcus Harris for his dignity under pressure, calling him a role model. Others accused him of playing the victim, dismissing the incident as overblown. But Marcus refused to be pulled into the chaos. He stayed grounded, focusing on what mattered: the restaurant, his staff, and the community he'd worked so hard to serve. It was early evening when Marcus stood outside Harvest Grove, hands in the pockets of his tailored black coat, watching the golden glow of the restaurant's lights spill onto the sidewalk. A subtle breeze rustled the trees lining the street, and for the first time in days, the air felt calm. "Busy tonight," Peter said, stepping up beside him. "Yeah," Marcus replied, a faint smile playing on his lips. The tables were full inside, the hum of conversation audible even from where they stood. Life was moving forward, as it always did. "Still no word about Reynolds?" Peter asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Marcus shook his head. "Not yet." Peter let out a frustrated sigh. "Of course not." "I didn't expect anything," Marcus said quietly. "You can't always change people overnight, Pete. Sometimes, the win is in showing up and staying true to yourself." Peter looked at him, his expression softening. "You're a better man than me, Marcus. I'd still be throwing punches." Marcus chuckled, though there was no bitterness in his voice. "We fight different battles." The sound of footsteps interrupted them. A woman and her teenage son approached, both wearing hesitant smiles. The boy, no older than 15, looked up at Marcus with wide, admiring eyes. "Mr. Harris?" the woman asked gently. Marcus turned toward her, his expression warm. "That's me." "I just wanted to say, thank you," she said softly, clutching her son's shoulder. "We saw what happened on the news. My son here, he's been struggling. Kids at his school don't always see him for who he is." The boy looked down at his sneakers, clearly shy, before glancing back up. "What you did, staying calm like that, it showed me that I don't have to lose myself to stand up for what's right." Marcus' chest tightened. He wasn't sure what to say at first, so he simply held out his hand. The boy shook it firmly, his smile growing. "Thank you," Marcus said sincerely. "That means more than you know." The woman nodded, a hint of emotion in her eyes, before leading her son down the street. Marcus watched them disappear around the corner, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his chest, heavy but good, like roots sinking deeper into the earth. Peter clapped a hand on his shoulder. "See, you're changing things, Marcus." "Maybe," Marcus replied. "Or maybe I'm just showing people that we don't have to break to win." Peter smiled faintly. "Well, you've got my vote." A week later, Marcus stood in the middle of Harvest Grove after closing time, surrounded by the low hum of dishwashers and the distant clatter of cutlery being cleaned. The restaurant had emptied out for the night, the last customers lingering just long enough to leave generous tips for the staff. Marcus moved from table to table, straightening chairs and adjusting the salt and pepper shakers, as he often did when the day was done. There was something peaceful about it, a small ritual that brought order to the chaos. As he worked, the door creaked open. Marcus looked up, expecting Peter or one of the staff who might have forgotten something. Instead, Officer Reynolds stood there, out of uniform. He wore a simple gray jacket and jeans, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked nothing like the man who had confronted Marcus days before. His shoulders were slumped, and his face was drawn tight with something between guilt and exhaustion. Marcus straightened slowly, his heart giving a dull thud. "You're a little late for dinner." Reynolds hesitated, his gaze flicking around the empty restaurant before settling on Marcus. "Hey, I wanted to talk to you." Marcus studied him for a moment, unsure of what to expect. "Go ahead." Reynolds stepped forward, though he didn't get too close. "I messed up." His voice was low, quieter than Marcus had ever heard it. "I've messed up a lot of things, to be honest." Marcus folded his arms across his chest, waiting. "I don't have an excuse," Reynolds continued. "I saw you sitting there, and I didn't stop to think. I just reacted. And I was wrong." "You were," Marcus said evenly, though his voice carried no malice. Reynolds swallowed hard, as if forcing himself to continue. "I've been doing this job for a long time. I've made a lot of assumptions. About people. about their intentions. And most of the time, I never thought twice about it. But seeing myself in that video, seeing what I did. He trailed off, his voice catching slightly. For the first time, Marcus saw something real behind his eyes. Regret, maybe shame. I can't change what I did, Reynolds said finally. But I want to be better. I don't know if that matters to you, but I needed to say it. Marcus studied him carefully, searching for any sign of insincerity. He didn't see one. Words are easy, officer, Marcus said softly. Being better. That's the hard part. Reynolds nodded, his expression pained. I know. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Marcus walked to the counter, picked up a clean glass, and poured Reynolds a glass of water. He set it down on the nearest table. Sit, Marcus said. Reynolds blinked, surprised. What? Sit down, Marcus repeated. You came here to talk, so sit. I'll listen. Reynolds hesitated, then slowly lowered himself into the chair. Marcus sat across from him, the two men facing each other in the quiet restaurant. No uniforms, no titles, no anger. Just two men, trying to find common ground. Marcus wasn't naive enough to think that one conversation could fix everything. But maybe it was a start. Weeks later, Harvest Grove buzzed with life. The restaurant had become more than a dining spot. It had become a symbol of resilience, respect, and community. People came not just for the food, but for the story. For Marcus. In a corner booth, Marcus sat quietly, watching the room the same way he always did. Peter slid into the seat across from him, a grin on his face. Full house again, Peter said. We're going to need more tables soon. Marcus chuckled softly, his eyes scanning the restaurant. Not a bad problem to have. Peter raised his glass in a toast. To the man who built this place, and to the fights worth fighting. Marcus clinked his glass against Peter's, his smile calm and steady. To moving forward, Marcus said simply. As the sound of laughter and conversation filled the air, Marcus allowed himself a quiet moment of peace. He'd proven himself, again, not to anyone else, but to himself. And that was the victory he'd been chasing all along.